The Lord said to me, the time is ripe for my people Israel. I will spare them no longer. In that day, declares the sovereign Lord, the songs in the temple will turn to wailing. Many, many bodies flung everywhere. Silence. Hear this, you who trample the needy and do away with the poor of the land. Those who say, when will the new moon be over, that we might sell grain and the Sabbath be ended, that we may market wheat, skimping the measure, boosting the price, and cheating with dishonest scales, buying the poor with silver and the needy for a pair of sandals, selling even the sweepings with the wheat. The Lord has sworn by the pride of Jacob, I will never forget anything they have done. Will not the land tremble for this, and all who live in it mourn? The whole land will rise like the Nile, it will be stirred up and then sink like the river of Egypt. In that day, declares the sovereign Lord, I will make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth in broad daylight. I will turn your religious feasts into mourning and all your singing into weeping. I will make all of you wear sackcloth and shave your heads. I will make that time like mourning for an only son and the end of it like a bitter day. The days are coming, declares the sovereign Lord, when I shall send a famine through the land, not a famine of food or a thirst for water, but a famine of hearing the words of the Lord. Men will stagger from sea to sea and wander from north to east, searching for the word of the Lord, but they will not find it. That was cheerful, wasn't it? Encouraging. Just the thing you need to hear on a day like today. Be beaten around the head just like that. But we have to hear it. From time to time it's necessary. So who was this chap Amos? Well, we have to set him in his context. After Solomon had died, there was a brief civil war which caused the kingdom over which Solomon had ruled and which had been established by his father David, the kingdom divided. The 12 tribes divided 10-2. The northern kingdom of 10 tribes and the southern kingdom of 2 tribes. But the southern kingdom, although only of 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin, had within it Jerusalem. Northern kingdom had no such centre. And for the next 100 years or so, they lived side by side, sometimes cooperating with each other, sometimes being at loggerheads with each other. There was an uneasiness of the relationship between the south and the north and the south. Amos came from the south. He was a man of the southern kingdom, a place called Tekoa. And he goes out of his way to explain that he's not a religious person in the sense of a priest or whatever. I'm neither a prophet nor a prophet's son, he said. I'm a herdsman, a dresser of figs, a farmer, simple soul. But God takes this simple soul and gives him a mission, And strangely, he takes Amos out of the south into the north. So Amos travels from the southern kingdom to the northern kingdom, and it's in the northern kingdom that he delivers his prophecy. And he comes to Bethel. Now Bethel is for the northern kingdom the equivalent of Jerusalem in the south. It is the religious centre. So Amos is sent to the heart of the northern kingdom, sent to Bethel. And there he meets with a man named Amaziah. Amaziah is the priest at Bethel, the high priest, if you like, the equivalent of the high priest of the temple of Jerusalem is Amaziah in Bethel. And Amos, this farmer from the south, a stranger to Amaziah, comes and addresses Amaziah, and through Amaziah the nation. He uses a series of pictures, word pictures. We read of the basket of ripe fruit, from which comes that lovely phrase, the time is ripe. Strange where phrases originate, isn't it? We use it so often in our day-to-day speech. The time is ripe. And it comes from Amos and his illustration of a basket full of ripening fruit. I think all of us have known what it is to have fruit ripen. But before we know it, ripened fruit has rotted. Bananas are the worst, aren't they? You like to have a ripe banana. There's nothing worse than an unripe banana, but boy, bananas don't stay ripe for long. And before you know it, they've gone over, as we might say. Ripened fruit becomes rotten fruit very easily, unless you're very careful with it. And Amos's message is this: ripened fruit, you're becoming rotting fruit. Another illustration he uses is of a plumb line. And he says, God will measure you concerning your uprightness. But what was this message that he brought? We heard some of it earlier. It was somewhat uncompromising, but it's nevertheless a word in season for us in our time as much as anything. Realizing, of course, that we live as Christians, so we have the teaching of Jesus to temper the message of Amos, which was given before ever the notion of Jesus coming amongst us originated. But the first thing he talks about is judgment. And what he says is, judgment is only as good as the justice and the fairness which gives rise to it. So we all make judgments. We're armchair critics. We sit at home, we watch the telly, we see this individual and that individual, we hear about this and we hear about that, and in our own minds we make a judgment. Well, you can trust him, but you can't trust him. You can trust her, but I'm not so sure about her. That doesn't sound right to me. We make judgments all the time, because that's how we are. But we never take a step back and ask ourselves, on what basis are we making that judgment? What prejudices are we bringing to bear upon the process of making a judgment? And Amos is saying, in effect, to the likes of Amaziah and through him to the people, you have compromised your judgment by allowing yourselves to be corrupted by greed. So you have that litany of examples of how they would go out of their way to cheat the people, especially the poor people, who would have no advocate for themselves. They were at the mercy of others. The system was corrupt. And as a consequence, any judgment that was handed down was the product of corruption. Inbuilt prejudices giving rise to corruption at the expense of fairness and justice. If we're honest with ourselves, I think each one of us has an element of prejudice about us. There's a knee-jerk reaction. We rush to judgment over this, that, and the other. And sometimes we're embarrassed when the judgment we made is shown up to be what it is, wrong. Of course, we've had high-profile examples over time of miscarriages of judgment through the courts. But even at the personal level, the evaluating of individuals, first impressions leave a lasting impression. And even when we learn differently, we find it hard to put aside that first impression. And so Amos comes and said, we've got to find a way out of this. How can we find a way of cutting through the corruption of judgment that is present amongst our society? And Amos says we have to recognize that judgment rests with God. The only source of judgment that we can rely on to be just and fair is God. God alone judges. And that springboards us into the New Testament. When we come to think about Jesus and what Jesus said and did. Because Jesus' words and actions amongst us, as much as anything, reveal God's judgment. For instance, he says to us, who are you to judge anyway? Before ever we start, who are you to judge? Take the plank out of your own eye. Then you might be able to see clearly to remove the speck you thought was in your brother's eye. It's not for you to judge. It's for me to judge. Judgment rests with God. And in Jesus, God has judged us. And we have been found wanting. Exposed as sinners, essentially selfish. But in order to cut through that, he has taken to himself in Jesus our selfishness in a selfless act, is dying on the cross. So how does God judge? God judges at Calvary. We're all guilty, yet we can all be forgiven. Echoes of Amos down through the centuries, calling out the corruption of his day and seeing it reconciled through the judgment of God visited upon Jesus for the sake of us all. So Amos speaks of divine judgment. He also talks about true worship. True worship. What does it mean to worship God? In the Northern Kingdom, as in the Southern Kingdom, religion has become institutionalized. It was a thing you did. There was a calendar of festivals that you observed, and it became almost mechanical. We ticked off the calendar. They didn't have months of the year in the same way that we do. They would measure the year by the seasons. Think of that hymn, summer and winter, seed time and harvest. No spring or autumn. Summer and winter, seed time, springtime, harvest, autumn time. They would measure the year by the turning of the seasons and also by the festivals as they came up during the year. That was how they measured the time. So for them, religion had become institutionalized and mechanistic and had lost sight of the object of worship, which was God. Doing it for doing its sake, regardless. But Amos says, no, we have to rediscover what it means to worship in truth. The name given to the northern kingdom was Samaria. And Jesus finds himself travelling through Samaria. He has to go from Jerusalem to Galilee, and the journey is through Samaria. And he finds himself needing a drink. Thirsty. It's a hot day. What can he do to get a drink? Well, fortunately, there's a well. There's a well. How is he going to get the water to drink out of the well? Well, isn't he fortunate? There's a woman who just happens to be there at the same time, and she's drawing water. So Jesus says, pleased to see you. Can you give me a drink? And the woman says, yes, fine, have a drink. And you've got that picture in your mind's eye of the two of them perched on the edge of the well. And they're chatting. And they do what people do to chat. Okay, what's your name? Where are you from? Blah, blah, blah. Like we always do. In 5 minutes we know everybody's life story. That's the way conversations go in Wales. Well, it was the same in Samaria. They got to, and Jesus here, I know all about you. You've been married 6 times. Elizabeth Taylor, Zaza Gabor, eat your heart out. You've been married 6 times. And worse still, the chap you're with now, you've not even married him, have you? Well, how to win friends and influence people. But the woman, on hearing this, realizing the situation, tries to deflect the conversation and begins to talk about circumstance. And she says to Jesus, my forefathers used to worship God on this mountain, pointing away to the hills, Gerizim, in the distance. Not having access to Jerusalem, they had to find places such as Bethel, amongst the hills, to worship. My people used to worship God on that mountain. And Jesus' response, the time is coming when you will worship in spirit and in truth. It won't matter where you are. It won't matter who you are. It won't matter what your circumstances are. What will really matter is the integrity of the worship that you bring. The motivation and application that attaches to the worship in which you engage. So forget about the mountains over there. Forget about the temple in Jerusalem. And as Jesus later on will say, the Jerusalem temple will be made to fall in on itself. But still, worship of God in spirit and truth will remain. So Amos's call, echoed by Jesus all those centuries later, was a call to worship in spirit and in truth, acknowledging we're under the judgment of God, yet forgiven by him, in order that we might come and worship in spirit and truth, acknowledging the God who has forgiven us in Christ. Worship in spirit and in truth. So how do these two things live together? Divine judgment and true worship. Well, Amos says it's nothing unless it has practical expression. Unless it has practical expression. And how might that be? Well, he says, go into the world in which you live, the community of which you're a part, and exercise judgment not just for its own sake, but for God's sake. Be prepared to hold one another to account in the name of God. Or for us as Christians, to bring a Christian perspective to bear on the wider society of which we are a part and to which we belong. Being prepared to acknowledge that whilst, if left to our own devices, we might judge something to be this, that, or the other, we are under the judgment of God to think in a particular way. Make me a captive, Lord, and then I shall be free. Force me to render up my sword, and I shall warrior be. Give up that freedom to be who I am, to decide for myself, to bring all my prejudices to bear. Give up all of that in order that I might be as Christ would be in the world of today. To be prepared to invite justice and fairness in Christ's name, not in my own name. The reality of justice is under God. Any justice I render of myself is an illusion. And we know that in our world today, whether it be in our immediate circle or it be across the globe, we know that in our world today there is much that is wrong. There are many people who are being wronged. There are many people who are being treated unjustly and unfairly by any measure. It behoves us to be like Amos and to be prepared to speak truth to power. To speak truth to power. Because those who are in power need to be educated in the truth. That same truth that emerges out of our worship of God through the Spirit. So Amos, we hear nothing more of him. Just a few chapters tucked away toward the end of the Old Testament. He appears on the stage of life and then leaves it. And who knows? But he's left us an enduring legacy, which we do well to remind ourselves of. God's judgment hangs over us, calling us to worship in spirit and truth, to see to it that that worship is enacted in the way we engage with the wrongs of our society. And in that spirit, we come to share in our communion. We sing, come let us sing